Vault Veritas SCP Files. Episode 29 Mimicry. Look, Niall, I know you said that Seth didn't want to join, but shouldn't Miranda be here for this? Shouldn't planning how to stop the Chaos Insurgency's attack be the department head's job and not ours? Here at the Foundation, the three of us are basically nobodies.
True. I mean, I like to think of myself as a little more than a nobody. But you're not wrong in that you, me, and Mary don't have any fancy titles that are actually worth a damn. But I find that real power comes from more than just a fancy title. Don't you?
Actually, I haven't found that at all. Are you honestly trying to tell us that being the head of security or the head of ethics isn't real power?
Oh, sure. Those two have been handed resources by the O4 Council they report to, but there's far more to power than that. My plan is what's going to stop Damien in the insurgency, and it doesn't rely on firepower nor defenses.
Then what does it rely on?
Connections. And careful planning.
By connections, you mean Agent Frey? A person who lacks all empathy, acts off her own authority, is essentially lawless and out of control, and is basically the antithesis of our ethics department?
When you frame it that way, then of course it sounds bad. I prefer to think of her as an ally, who is able to think on her own feet, unburdened by red tape and the sort of ethical considerations that may give others pause, in situations where quick and drastic decisions may be needed.
I like my way of framing it better.
Any other connections we need to be aware of?
I reached out to several other site directors to see about moving away many of our anomalies. You see, I figured that in any attack, the likelihood of a breach of containment is high. So, better to send away the anomalies that can cause the most harm. The site directors needed quite a bit of convincing in order to agree to house some of the more unstable SCPs. But I can be very persuasive when I want to be. And I have personal history with many of them.
I heard about the rehousing, actually.
Did you now? I thought I was pretty clear when I told Mary not to speak a word about it. But I see now that I was wasting my breath.
Relax, now. I only spoke to Scott. I figured the plan was to tell him anyway.
Miranda knows too. She's been helping me smuggle them out from under Seth's nose.
Seth isn't on board with that? Seems to me like he would find his job as head of security easier if there were fewer anomalies to secure.
I know that man well. He's full of foolish pride that would undoubtedly get in the way. He'd swear up and down that he'd be able to handle any breach, and that no breach would occur under his watch anyway. Fool. He's underestimating our enemy, and I'm not letting him put the site's safety in jeopardy just to stroke his ego.
I see. So we are quietly and secretly moving dangerous SCPs away from Site 2024.
And moving one into the site. That's where the careful planning piece comes back in.
It's a really, really bad idea. Worse than bringing in Agent Frey, if you can believe it.
I think you meant it's a really, really brilliant idea.
Why don't we let Scott be the judge of that?
Very well. Scott, here, read this, and then tell me whether or not you think my plan will work.
Do I get to hear what the plan is first?
After.
Okay then. Far be it from me to not read what I am given. Incident Report 236-05. Fifth known incident involving SCP-236, colloquially known as mimic crabs. Object Class: Keter. Keter? Wait, are you sure I'm supposed to be reading this? I haven't been given... I don't think I have the clearance level to...
It's fine. I'm the one who handed it to you. I'll take any heat that comes from this. You can read it on my authority.
If you're sure about that... I'm just supposed to avoid Keters because one of them was responsible for the injury that led to my memory loss, and Miranda doesn't want me to face any triggers.
That's not the SCP that caused the accident.
You know what caused my accident?
I have an inkling. What can I say? I know the Keters well, but I can tell you that it's absolutely not this SCP. This one has no mental effects whatsoever. It couldn't have caused any sort of cognitive injury.
Ah. Okay. Object Class: Keter. Risk Assessment Level: High. Reported by Lead Researcher Dr. Catherine Ingram. Report date is redacted. I wonder if anyone will even be able to read this report. But it's not really my responsibility to make it legible for you, is it? I'm just supposed to write what happened, and that's rather difficult with my good hand all mangled. So forgive me for not exactly worrying over whether or not you can read the writing of my non-dominant hand. You'll figure it out if it's important to you. You've all been trying to blame me for what happened and trying to write me up, as though I haven't already suffered enough. You vultures. My right hand is a useless lump of scarred flesh, and it will probably never heal. And yet it took Niall to tell you all that it was punishment enough for my mistake.
You're in this one, Niall? I didn't know that you knew this particular Keter so personally.
Well, you know me. If it's a Keter, someone at some point will come seeking my expertise.
And yet you don't have a meaningful title to your name? Why is that?
Now what would I do with one of those? Hush, listen to the report.
I suppose I can admit that I should have been more careful with the crabs. But there's a fine line between safety and scientific progress. Pushing the boundaries of knowledge is so much of what we do here. These same people who lecture me about care are being just as reckless in their own tests. They just haven't had it backfire upon them. Yet. The mimic crabs already had basic safety protocols around them when I was sent to continue testing. It's always a little alarming when you're sent as a backup or a replacement. It just gets you wondering about what exactly happened to the person before you, and whether it could happen to you as well. In this particular case, I was sent to be the second replacement. I almost considered passing up the opportunity entirely. But the name Mimic is so utterly filled with potential. Just think of what the Foundation could do with a creature that can mimic objects. If we could harness that power, use it, we could create convincing decoys for groups of interest that try to stir up trouble. We could disguise high-risk SCPs as more mundane objects. We could mimic medical supplies or containment supplies if desperate. Just think of how useful that would be. And all of it, all of the potential uses, they would be attributed to me. The previous researchers had uncovered the basics of 236. The SCP is a swarm of miniature crabs, nearly microscopic, which do not have any relation to known non-anomalous species. These little crustaceans appear to operate as part of a hive mind, synchronizing in perfect unison and growing increasingly intelligent as they swarm. I knew going in that the swarms could nearly perfectly mimic inanimate objects, molding themselves into intricate patterns and shapes, and holding that form for sometimes hours on end as they waited for the approach of prey. I learned quickly that this tactic was how they killed the first researcher assigned to their case. They had collectively decided to take on the form of an elaborate wooden chest, an item that was so out of place that the researcher really should have known better than to approach. The second researcher, however, I'll admit, I had a little more pity for. She made the rather simple mistake of not checking the cameras after returning to the room from a brief break, and found that the wooden stool she had brought in previously was no longer as solid as she'd remembered when she attempted to sit upon it. Their ability to fully break down organic material and consume it, only to then replicate it in an impressive disguise is... well, how could the researcher have possibly known beforehand? I knew better than to make those same mistakes. For the weeks I was assigned, I checked every object in that room any time I had to enter, never approaching anything unless I knew the location of the swarm and what it was they were up to. They were persistent little demons, and during my time there they tried pretending to be everything we brought in with us at least once. When I started sending in the D classes, I was so sure that my tests were thorough that I'd considered every possible thing they could do. The first tests were standard confirmation of the mimicry ability. It was all very simple. Place a handful of small objects in their room, some pens, a box of paper clips, a stapler. Give the crabs time to do their work, and then introduce a D class and see if they can identify anything off in the room before the crabs attack and feed. The next tests were a little more complicated. I conducted several to assess what would disrupt the mimicry, and found that they retained the shape and property of the mimicked objects when they were picked up, squeezed, inspected, or even used as you would use the object itself. Well, right up until they attacked, of course. As far as we could tell, only the application of an intensely bright light could disrupt their formations. It was a promising start. I could feel the tantalizing taste of fame hanging just within my reach. If the mimicked objects worked just as the originals, then all we needed was a way to keep the crabs docile and holding on to their form. I had the rather brilliant idea that since they treated light as an aversive stimuli, perhaps it could be used as an effective punishment to incentivize them to stay in a particular formation. I began the training immediately, overseeing the installation of bright fluorescent overhead lights. I provided the crabs with a roll of gauze bandages to mimic. Anytime they began to break that formation, I flicked the overhead lights on. Of course, they would scatter and diffuse in pain, pressing up against the sides of the room, desperately seeking solace. And I would dim the lights, wait for the group to reform, mimic the bandages, rinse and repeat. It took them about a week for them to understand the connection between the pain of the light and their movements out of their mimicked state. But it worked. Don't you see how amazing that is? How impressive my work is? I trained them to mimic exactly the object I wanted, and then to stay that way for as long as I desired. It's amazing work. You have to admit that. That's the part people should be focusing on. The fact that it's possible, that I proved it. Not the fact that it makes them dislike you. That they were smart enough not only to be trained, but to realize that I was the one causing them pain and distress. It was just a few days ago. It was the big test, the confirmation of all my brilliance. The test to see if the bandage could be used. If the crabs would keep their form even when presented with potential prey. I was so convinced it would work, so sure that I had found the secret to control over this anomaly. And my research was so promising that it even attracted an observer. As I approached the testing room, heart aflutter with the promise of fortune, I noticed that there was a young officer present, talking quietly and fervently with the D-class I had selected for the procedure. The officer was short and neatly dressed, with red hair styled in a professional cut that framed his sharp features. His intense green eyes flickered with both authority and concern, and he spoke earnestly and softly with my tester. I approached them, hands curling into fists, ready to chew him out for interference in my test. But he gave me this look filled with such heartfelt warmth that I could feel all my irritation simply melt away. The officer introduced himself as...
Niall Connors, specialist in both Keeters and ethics. Surely you've heard of me.
The name was familiar, of course. There are always those names you hear dropped casually during meals in the canteen, or see plastered over every new paper, or hear thrown about as people brag about their connections. I was surprised to see how young he appeared. With all that was attached to his name, I was expecting a middle-aged officer, toughened from years on the job, not some gentle and scrawny millennial. He shook my hand and sung my praises.
What interesting work you're doing here.
As we walked together into our observation room. He was
So excited about the possibilities this test can unlock.
and we spoke at length about all the ways this research could change life in the Foundation. And so, with all my chances at fame right within my grasp, I started the test. An attending security officer used his knife to give the D-Class a 1-inch cut along the inside of his forearm, released him into the dimly lit room, and he was instructed to bandage his wound. We watched in total silence as he did so, wrapping the length of mimicked gauze around and around his arm. My heart was drumming, and I could see Niall lean forwards, his face a mask of intense concentration.
Could this live up to the potential and the hype?
We waited for the crabs to suddenly turn, to attack, to burrow into the wound and begin to feed. And they didn't. They didn't. I could have wept with joy at that simple fact. The conditioning had worked. I moved to the door, and Niall placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, stopping me.
Give it time,
He said softly. I should have listened. I should have given it more time. You don't get to be that notable a name without really knowing the anomalies. But I was so delirious from the joy of the success. Do you know, I actually thought for a moment that he was here to steal it from me. It would have made sense. All the success that he had enjoyed at such a young age.
surely was stolen. For how could one be so impressive in such a short amount of time?
I shrugged out of his grasp and left anyway, entering the test room.
Feeling defiant and proud.
To shake the D-Class's hand and observe the mimicked bandage for myself without the pain of observation glass in the way. I reached my hand out towards his arm, noting the small drops of crimson blood that had wet down the gauze, probably driving those microscopic crabs crazy with hunger, but still not quite enough to overcome their fear of the light they knew I controlled. I touched his arm, the tips of my fingers brushing the edge of the gauze. And then, the world erupted in a flash of light. The explosion was sudden and jarring, spreading out from the bandage, ripping my tester's arm apart into jagged, bloody chunks. My outstretched hand disappeared into the light, and my entire arm shook with the force of the explosion. It pushed me backwards, catapulting me into the observation glass.
Hard enough to leave spider-webbed cracks from the point of impact.
And I crumpled into a heap, cradling my arm into my body. The waves of pulsing agony shot through me, over and over. My hand was nothing but charred meat and splintered bone, and I couldn't move but for the shock. The explosion had scattered the swarm, but only momentarily, and they banded together now to approach their injured prey. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was the door to the testing room swinging open.
As the attractive and objectively correct Irish officer came to her heroic rescue.
Yikes. That was intense. I'm amazed you could even read it, though. To me, it just looks like a scrawl.
Yeah, it does to me too. I don't know. When I started reading it, though, it just made sense. But I don't understand. Why was there an explosion?
It's a defense mechanism of the crabs. An anomalous feature that the researchers failed to uncover due to their intense focus on the more noticeable anomalous property of mimicry. Such incompetence. But Catherine's injury doesn't matter one bit. What do you think of the plan?
I'm not sure I understand it. What do the crabs have to do with the attack?
Why, mimicry, my good lads. The Chaos Insurgency thinks we have an anomaly they desperately want. So we can bring in the mimics. These mimics that were specifically trained to hold a shape for a long period of time, and set one hell of an explosive trap.
Yeah, because that turned out so well for Dr. Ingram.
What's the SCP that they're after?
One that doesn't exist. I may have let slip to Damien that we have an anomaly that can whip other SCPs into a frantic state, or turn them completely docile. Quite a prize for the Chaos Insurgency and their goals, no? They're convinced we have it here in this site. So we bring in the mimics, have them pretend to be that object.
And when Damien and his soldiers show up to steal it, kaboom.
Kaboom.
And then the crabs escape containment, and we're dealing with an escaped Keter that can mimic just about anything and eats people alive.
So we put it in an explosion-proof room with some extra security. Won't look amiss.
Sure. What could go wrong?
Mary, darling, surely you heard the secondary message of that tape, no?
Yeah, I heard it. Still going to raise my concerns, though.
Secondary message?
That I and my instincts are always right.
Vault Veritas SCP Files is a podcast inspired by the SCP Foundation. Mimicry is based on SCP-236 by Dr. Gears from the SCP Wiki located at scpwiki.com/SCP-236. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 unported license. This episode featured Justin Gellner as Scott Anderson, D.R. Thompson as Niall Connors, and Cody W. as Meriwether Parker. It was written and edited by Leola Angel. We welcome comments. Please rate and review us. Email us at vaultveritas@gmail.com. Join our Discord channel using the link in the episode description. Tweet us at Vault Veritas, or for additional content, visit our Patreon. Thanks for listening.